Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tess Benko. I'm the Executive Director of the UCLA VA Veteran Family Wellness Center. We provide wellness-based resilience services, resources, and support for veterans and their families, including parents, couples, and kids. We're honored today to have with us Dr. Bill Nash. To begin with, if you have questions during the talk, please enter them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible as we can before the end of the presentation. For those interested in receiving a CE unit for this webinar, information will begin at the conclusion for how to access the survey. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nash. Dr. Bill Nash is a leading researcher, educator, and clinician in psychological health. He's a pioneer and expert in the prevention, recognition, and treatment of moral injury. Dr. Nash is a clinical and research psychiatrist at the VA Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System and a health sciences associate clinical professor at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, where he leads an emerging program of research, treatment, and prevention of moral injury in veterans and human service workers. He's also currently serving as a consultant to the United Nations to lead the development of a comprehensive PTSD program for peacekeeping operations. Previously, he served as the Director of Psychological Health for the U.S. Marine Corps, and while on active duty in the Navy, as a combat stress control psychiatrist embedded with the 1st Marine Division in Iraq. The Doctrine for Maintaining Psychological Health in Military Operations, written by Captain Nash in 2009, still informs leadership throughout the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, as well as other nations' militaries and civilian first responders. His peer-reviewed research with Marine infantrymen was the first to document PTSD in service members as a direct result of violations of moral expectations. Dr. Nash has co-authored 2 books about stress injury, Theory, Research, and Management, 2007, and Adaptive Disclosure, a new treatment for military trauma, loss, and moral injury in 2017. We're so honored to have you here with us today, Dr. Nash.
Thank you, Tess. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for taking this time out of your busy lives to have this conversation. I can't tell you how sad I feel that we're not able to do this face-to-face because, gosh, it would be so much more fun and interesting, but this is better than nothing for sure. So I put way too much information in these slides. Sorry, I couldn't pare it down anymore. So I'm going to rock it through like the first half of it, but with the understanding that I've provided a PDF of the slides to Tom and Veteran Family Wellness Center so they can distribute them to everybody. My email address is on here in a couple places. So if you have any questions that we can't answer during this hour, please write to me. Let's talk. So my disclaimers, I mean no one ill will, but I need to warn you that I am going to be examining some popular conceptions of trauma from an unflattering light. So these are my definitions as a starting point. Moral injury, I call literal harm to a person or community as a direct result of betrayals of moral trust in high-stakes situations. The prevailing psychological definition of moral injury as a betrayal of expectations makes it seem like it's more of an internal process than an interpersonal process, which is what I am now convinced that moral injury is, and hopefully you will be by the end of this hour as well. Betrayal of moral trust. It always happens in a relationship between 2 moral agents. Trauma. This definition of trauma is the slickest one by far in my book. This is SAMHSA's recent concept of trauma, 2014. An event that is experienced as emotionally harmful and that has lasting adverse effects on functioning and well-being. With that definition, moral injury is certainly a subset of trauma. Which subset, we don't know yet, but I think accruing evidence is making it seem more and more likely that moral injury probably represents the bulk of trauma, lifespan trauma. Identity, the core self, which is developed and maintained in relation to other people, places, and things. My own conception, understanding of how the self and identity develop and how they're maintained in relationships is based on psychoanalytic concepts, object relations, self-psychology. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the self-psychology later. But right now, I just want to draw attention to this very useful fact, this nexus that Marilyn Brewer's 1991 very influential paper about the social self based on European social psychology. Her model is really the same as mine. She says social identities, which are the parts of us that grow in relationship to others, are not subdivision of our internal self-concepts and behavior patterns, as she makes the point, I'm no expert on this, that American psychologists tend to think of social identity as like a subset of your internal schemas, right? But with thinking that all these things are internal. She says, no, they are extensions of our personal selves acquired by growing new social identities. Therefore, and this is crucial, that means that identities expand and contract during the course of our lives based on current social identifications. Which do you think feels better? Which do you think is more painful? Obviously, contraction. And in fact, social contraction, the loss of belonging, becoming a burden to your social group, are two of the most powerful predictors of suicide, according to Thomas Joyner's model, which has a lot of support. And then finally, this is crucial for self-esteem. That self-esteem is dependent entirely on the success of your social identities, which is another humongous driver of well-being and illness that we've neglected. Okay, so first thing is we need to be upfront. Moral injury is not something new. You know, the term was first coined in 94 rather, by Jonathan Shea, and then Brett Litz published a paper in 2009. But really, there's plenty of evidence that's been around forever. Some of my friends in theology and the chaplaincy published a book a couple years ago. I think it's called Moral Injury in Sacred Texts. And there's a chapter for every sacred text of the world showing that moral injury is at the very center of the problem of living. That's not new. People who look for like a little patch of untilled soil to plant their moral injury flag in and say, well, at least it doesn't overlap with anything else. Well, that's not science. What we want to do is start with the broadest possible aperture, and then only when we have good reason to rule things out as being part of moral injury. So the point I want to make now, I'm going to walk you through a timeline that the conception of all trauma as a wound to a person's identity is also not a new concept. I'm going to spend a little time on this timeline, but I think it's useful because for one thing, it's important to recognize in the world of science and the art of health care, 50 years is an incredibly short time. It's a blink of an eye. And if you look at this timeline, okay, PTSD, our principal post-traumatic stress diagnosis, was created in 1980 in DSM-3, and it was created from two syndromes that were identified in the 70s, post-Vietnam syndrome and rape trauma syndrome. But it wasn't until 1988, with the publication in the US of the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, NVVRS, where we even had good evidence that at least war-related PTSD was a very serious problem affecting the health, well-being, and survival of a great number of US veterans. So here, 88, we're almost halfway through this timeline before we're even sure we have a problem. So over the next 10 years, 5 very influential books were published about the nature of trauma. What is it? 3 of them the ones I've color coded green are theories and models that see trauma as a wound to a person's social identity, social self. The other two, the orange ones, are entirely 180 out view of trauma, not as something, not as a way in which a person is damaged by life or even changed by life, so much as learning bad habits or having bad habits before reaching the trauma. So this first book is still the most widely revered book about trauma ever written. Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery. And this passage, to me, is still the most perfect thing, beautiful thing said about trauma. Traumatic events call into question basic human relationships. They breach the attachments of family, friendship, love, and community. They shatter the construction of the self that is formed and sustained in relation to others. Judith Herman, in her studying this identity wound form of trauma, also coined a diagnostic term, complex PTSD, which Jonathan Shea and his work with veterans echo the same thing. And I'm going to show you a little later why that conception of complex PTSD really is a far better description of moral injury as an outcome than PTSD as it currently resides in DSM. Unfortunately, the APA, American Psychiatric Association, DSM, kept complex PTSD an orphan in one of the appendices of DSM until the most recent one, DSM-5. Now it's not in there at all. It is in ICD-11, however, which is going to really move the ball on this problem. We can finally start to do some research on it. So the second influential book was Ronnie Janoff Bowman's Shattered Assumptions. And she not only theorized and treated, and all five of these people were clinicians, but she did research to document that changes in the degree to which a person held these three beliefs, the degree to which those beliefs were decremented, lost, impaired, lessened, correlated strongly with the severity of the PTSD symptoms. And those three necessary assumptions were the self is worthy, the world is benevolent, and life has meaning. I'm good, the world is good, life makes sense. So her point is, any damage to those three beliefs significantly impairs your ability to be in the world, to have a social self. And finally, Jonathan Shea has worked with Vietnam veterans, comparing their experience to Achilles in Vietnam, returning from the Trojan War. In the Trojan War, he coined the term moral injury, and this is his statement about it, which I agree with completely, that fear alone people get over, even grief alone people get over. But if moral trust has been violated, then that's a much more difficult wound to heal. So on the other side, we got first Patty Resick in '93, publishing her book on cognitive processing therapy. This is the only statement I could find in the early part of the book, sort of giving the rationale for CPT as a treatment for PTSD. And she says, so many clients with PTSD have extreme beliefs and have been traumatized repeatedly early in life. One of the goals of CPT is to teach these clients greater flexibility in thinking, specifically to think critically about why the event happened and its implications. And I know that last part has to do with the common, ubiquitous experience of shame, even among those who have been raped, even if there's no rational reason to blame themselves, that shame is hardwired. So there really wasn't much evidence in '92 or '93 that any of these proposed risk factors for PTSD were really significant. Extreme beliefs, early life trauma, inflexible thinking, uncritical thinking. We're going to look at meta-analyses in a moment to see how those risk factors stack up against stress-related risk factors. And then the other maladaptive coping model is the one by Edna Foa's prolonged exposure, which is based on Mauer's two-factor model of PTSD, which is one factor is fear conditioning, but fear conditioning always goes away by itself. There's no rat model for persistent chronic PTSD because whatever they do to a rat, it goes away in 21 days. So the second part of the two-factor is to say, well, it must be because they avoid memories, reminders, so they don't get a chance to be deconditioned. So that's the two-factor, fear conditioning and avoidance as a maladaptive coping mechanism. There's also precious little evidence that fear or maladaptive avoidance are etiologic in any post-traumatic stress state. This treatment came from phobias, from treatment for phobias. And one of the stark differences between post-traumatic stress disorder and a simple phobia, like a spider phobia, is that in trauma, something really bad actually happened. It isn't like I'm afraid of this spider, but I've never been bitten by a spider. I'm afraid of heights, but I've never fallen off of a roof. But in trauma, something bad did happen. And the other thing that I'm going to draw attention to is avoidance is not because of fear. It's because of dissociation, which is a whole different animal. So what should have happened if science had done its job, were doing its job, around the turn of the century, we would have said, wow, we've got two very different ways of looking at trauma here. Let's do some studies to figure out which one explains more of the outcome, which one has a better evidence base. That didn't happen. Instead, at least in the US, our government, the military and the VA, bought PE and CPT as treatments for PTSD and rolled them out broadly as basically a social experiment. So no attempt was made to say, well, we know there's others, Judith Herman and Janoff Bowman and Shea, they have different views, but here's why we think our view makes more sense. They didn't even try. They just said, this is how it is. This is the way we see it. And so we roll out PE and CPT as basically an experiment. So since then, there has been evidence that this experiment has failed in at least two ways. The first way is stigma. The likely significant impact the maladaptive coping model has on mental health stigma. That was brought to our attention starkly in 2007 when Washington Post published a series of articles about the way Army soldiers waiting for medical discharges for PTSD were being treated by Army clinicians at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. They were being treated like criminals. They were being treated like criminals, like they were cowards in the classic World War II sense. That should have been a watershed event for military and veteran mental health, at least in the U.S., because it sparked a series of task forces that investigated the problem. The biggest one was the DoD Mental Health Task Force, which is a huge effort. They went to many military and veteran facilities and bases. Their report, which came later in 2007, drew attention first and foremost to stigma. They said the first biggest problem we have is mental health stigma. And if the DoD and the VA want to get their arms around this, we have got to fix stigma. That has not happened. So, and I'm going to come back to stigma. So then the other evidence that this experiment did not succeed, of course, is two recent JAMA reviews, one in 2015, the other one just last year. 2015 review was one of the first meta-analyses of 36 RCTs for military but non-combat PTSD. These are mostly rape, military sexual trauma, accidents, very little combat. But even for those 36 RCTs, of which 9 were PE and CPT, 27 were something else, there was no difference. PE and CPT were in no way better than the others. And then the final JAMA review came out last year with the very first ever randomized controlled clinical trial of PE and CPT for combat PTSD. And the reason that it took until 2020 to publish that first RCT is because they couldn't get soldiers to stay or other service members to stay in treatment long enough to get a result. So this was the first time they even got far enough to publish a result. So I'm not going to go through these anymore. These are the 2 JAMA reviews. I just put them in here so you can refer to them. The 2015 dropout rate was 27%. An Institute of Medicine report in 2008, by the way, which reviewed the evidence of the efficacy of PE and CPT for military PTSD, they said, you know what, there's no way we're ever going to be able to conclude that prolonged exposure is effective when the dropout rate is so high that you don't need much worsening in those who drop out to negate and wipe out the gains in those who remain. So dropout rates, 60 to 72% still were diagnosable after treatment. And if you look at the between group effect sizes, if anything, PE and CPT did a little worse than the other 27 RCTs. Then the last one is this 746 soldiers with combat PTSD treated at Fort Hood. And as you can see, 31% recovered or improved. And the dropout rate was up to 48% in some of the PE samples. No differences in outcomes, and including transcendental meditation and everything else that they tried. Okay, stigma. As I said, the 2007 Mental Health Task Force report drew attention to stigma as our biggest problem in public mental health in the military and veteran communities, at least, if not elsewhere. The only evidence I've been able to find that the Army or any military has actually studied the problem is for like 10 years running, the Army mental health advisory teams, which are these researchers that were sent into Iraq and Afghanistan, like between 2003 and 2013, to survey soldiers and in some cases Marines for mental health problems, and then survey them about their stigmatizing beliefs. And here you can see the answers to stigma questions. For all these years, you see the numbers of the percentages that believe it would be too embarrassing to get mental health care. It would harm my career. I would be seen as weak. They would blame me for the problem. These numbers, number one, have not changed at all over these years. It's rock solid steady. So whatever this is structural in the system. The second thing, which is really disturbing for me, look how much higher the response rates were for these stigma questions for people who screened positive. So that means if you have in theater an active mental health problem, acute stress disorder, depression, anxiety, panic, whatever, you're twice as likely to say, you know what, the Army will give me a hard time if I tell anybody about this. They'll blame me for it. They'll lose confidence in me. Why would that be twice as likely in people who screen positive? I can only conclude it's because they experienced all those things, because it did harm their career, because people did lose confidence in them, because they were seen as weak, which is exactly what the Washington Post articles saw at Walter Reed. So I have not seen any studies in DoD of where's this stigma coming from and what do we do about it. This is the only study I've been able to find, even looking at the prevalence of stigma in the military health system. This is a study done by the famous psychopharmacologist Stephen Stahl, who was contracted by the Army to teach psychopharmacology to the prescribing nurses at the Fort Hood Warrior Transition Unit, which is where the soldiers at Fort Hood are kept and housed and treated while they're waiting their medical discharges for PTSD. He did this study of 310 enlisted non-commissioned officer cadre, who are the people that are responsible for the health, well-being, and survival of those soldiers, and 138 nurses who were treating them for PTSD. He did this survey because he was shocked at the levels of stigma among the staff in the Warrior Transition Unit. One of his questions was, how confident are you that PTSD is a real illness caused by military service? 43% of the enlisted NCOs at the Warrior Transition Unit said they didn't believe it was real, but 29% of the nurses didn't believe it was real. Where did they get that from? They were taught by the Army psychiatrists. That's who would have given them in-service training about how do you treat PTSD, blah, blah, blah. This is the same year that one of the Army psychiatrists killed 13 soldiers and wounded 30 others in what is certainly a story of serious moral injury. Okay, enough stigma. So how can we test these two models, maladaptive coping model, identity wound model? Well, one way is to examine them in terms of the stress vulnerability sort of meta theory about mental disorders. And it's also called stress diathesis model. And it's pretty widely accepted idea that mental disorders are caused by some combination of stress and pre-existing vulnerability. Some mental disorders have a much higher loading of pre-existing vulnerability, possibly genetic, biological, whatever. Others, like trauma and stressor-related disorders, they now have their own chapter in DSM. They're in that chapter because they do have a higher loading of environmental stress in their pathogenesis. So down below, I've kind of compared them. So the maladaptive coping model says vulnerability is a much bigger part of the problem. Identity wound model says the stressor is the problem, is a much bigger part of the problem. And at the extreme ends, people kind of act as if this is all really what it boils down to. I believe this. I don't think you need any pre-existing vulnerability whatsoever to be traumatized by a life event and have chronic long-term problems because of it. Stress alone can do that to you. I believe that completely. So how do we test it? We look for risk factor studies. So here's the first meta-analysis I want to show you of risk factor studies for PTSD from 2000. You can see the number of studies. There's a lot of studies, hundreds of studies, tens of thousands of participants. And everything in the top that's blue are pre-existing vulnerability risk factors, and the three at the bottom are the three stress-related risk factors. So look, the important thing here is the R, the correlation coefficient. So weighted average R. The highest correlation coefficient in the blue vulnerability risk factor section is other adverse childhood experience. And that had the correlation coefficient is 0.19. So the way I understand what that means in the real world is I square it. So 0.19 squared is approximately 0.04. That means that one pre-existing vulnerability variable accounts for only 4% of the observed outcome. Turn that on its head, if you eliminated all that particular risk factor, no longer had adverse childhood experiences, that would reduce the prevalence of adult onset PTSD by only 4%. That is noise. You know why I know it's noise? Because our agreed upon threshold for significance is 5%. Anything less than 5% can be ignored. The highest correlation coefficient they found in this meta-analysis with lack of social support, life stress, trauma severity. So lack of social support, R squared is 16%. That's still pretty small total variance. And in fact, in studies that have been done, particularly in trauma, if you add up all the variance, you can't explain more than about 30% of it. So that means the bigger part of it, we haven't even figured out a way to measure yet. So here's the second meta-analysis, 2003. Once again, top part of the pre-existing vulnerability risk factors, the bottom now growing in size are the stress-related risk factors. And I tell you, the reason I know I lived through this, the reason that between 2000 and 2003, there were many more studies of stress-related risk factors is because people saw that these pre-existing vulnerability risk factors weren't accounting for that much. And particularly the seminal work of my good friend Charlie Marmer at NYU. When he was at San Francisco, he was the first one to study peritraumatic dissociation in police and to show that that was the strongest predictor of chronic PTSD after any event. So what does it mean that the top two predictors for chronic serious PTSD are peritraumatic pain and peritraumatic loss of function? What do those two things add up to? Pain and loss of function because of an event. That is the definition of injury, people. That's what an injury is. That if social identities exist, and if they are as central to our functioning in the world and our ability to be human beings and do what we need to do, if it's as important as all that, we must be hardwired to know when that part of us has been damaged. And like any other damage, the first thing you feel is pain, and the second thing is I'm not functioning as well anymore. Okay, so those two meta-analyses were retrospective and cross-sectional. So because of the weakness of cross-sectional risk factor research, I convinced the Marine Corps to give us 4 battalions of infantry Marines, and that we followed over entire deployment cycle, including a 7-month deployment to either Iraq or Afghanistan. And we had like 900 and some variables. I mean, we drew DNA, we drew RNA. In fact, our DNA from this study with the work of Duling Baker, who was the lead PI at San Diego, our DNA was part of the large genome-wide association studies for PTSD, which, by the way, have yet to show a significant signal. I mean, there are little correlations, but in terms of what % of the outcome is predicted by genetics, it's pretty low. So we did this prospective longitudinal study. So we knew who had PTSD beforehand. We knew what their childhood trauma histories were. We had all that stuff beforehand, and after 8 months post-deployment, we were able to discern these 3 trajectories by growth mixture modeling, which accounted for the majority of the sample. That the 3 trajectories were: most people, 79%, had low stable symptoms, 8% had pre-existing PTSD, they had it at pre-deployment. As a group, they got better over time. And then 13% had new onset PTSD. That's a sizable number for new onset PTSD, but this particular battalion was a very high level of potentially traumatic events on a daily basis over 7 months. So what predicted membership in the new onset trajectory with respect to low stable? So what predicted who stayed in the blue versus who went into the green? So you see on the right, childhood trauma, W is roughly equivalent to R squared, so that's relative weight. Childhood trauma accounted for 1% of the outcome, prior lifespan trauma 2%, combat experiences only 3%. Moral injury events accounted for way more than that in our sample, but I'm not going to go into that right now. And once again, peritraumatic dissociation was the #1 predictor. This is the APA definition, American Psychiatric Association definition of dissociation, a breakdown in the normal information processing in the brain. People who tend to subscribe to the one of the maladaptive coping models, in my experience, tend to see peritraumatic dissociation as another form of maladaptive coping, that as if a person decides to dissociate as a way to keep from dealing with the painful reality. So that might make sense if you're only thinking about a very limited cognitive form of dissociation. But, you know, think of all the ways information processing can break down in the brain, and cognition is only one of many. So because of that realization, we also created and tested a peritraumatic behavior questionnaire as part of the marine resiliency study, which turned out to be our strongest predictor of post-deployment PTSD. And I highlight a few of the 15 items on here, which we drew from Charlie Marmer's PDEQ, Brunet's peritraumatic distress inventory, and Nijin Huis's, I think is pronounced, somatoform dissociation questionnaire, which is a European approach that, thank God, is the only people who are studying forms of somatic dissociation that were so prominent during World War I and World War II, shell shock, you know. So we created this 15-item questionnaire. This is a self-report form. We really created with the intent of using it for observer rating, for the corpsmen, the medics, to keep track of their Marines and recognize when one of these things happened. It didn't pan out, but still, these were very strong predictors. So there's so many different kinds of dissociation here. There's emotional dissociation, like number 6. For a period of time, I was unable to stop laughing, crying, or screaming. There's somatic physical dissociation, like number 10, I couldn't move my body. Or 12, my speech changed. Or 15, intense physical reactions, sweating, shaking, heart pounding. But there's also moral dissociations, like number 5. For a period of time, I was determined to get revenge. Or number 2, for a period of time, I felt fearless and invulnerable, as if nothing could harm me. So my point here is that peritraumatic dissociation is a very broad category of ways in which information processing can break down for a period of time. And sometimes these can persist for a long time. So to understand how that's possible, what is peritraumatic dissociation? If it's not maladaptive coping, you need to know a little bit more about how the brain is wired. So this is my understanding of the way a human brain works. This is from Paul MacLean's work, studying the evolution of the vertebrate brain over the last 550 million years. And what he learned is that the way vertebrate brains developed over all these years is not like Etch-a-Sketch, where, you know, the new capability replaces the old. It's not like you shake it, erase it, and then build a new brain. You can't do that. The way it evolves is each new capability is added on top of the old, as one on top of the other. And as each new capability is grown and develops, it wires, it connects with the lower centers. But those connections are very weak. And it's a, obviously, I think it's a strong protective survival mechanism that each of these 4 brains is capable of operating independently. Each one has its own memory systems, each has its own decision-making system, its own imagination, so the 4 brains are the fish brain, the reptile brain, the mammal brain, and the human brain. The shark brain, it has, and these evolutionary advancements are in terms of not only more complex information processing abilities, but in particular, social information processing. That's what these advancements are all about. It's not how to, survive better or mate better or paint prettier pictures necessarily. But so the shark brain has no social interest whatsoever. It has its only concern is survival and mating. The reptile brain, and this is from Paul MacLean's work, where he showed that in the part of the brain that becomes the nucleus accumbens, part of the basal ganglia in humans, that's where social hierarchies are hardwired. And he proved it by ablating these centers, and if he did it on one side, then the opposite eye did not recognize the social hierarchy, could not tell whether it was a higher or lower rank than one of the other lizards. So that dragon brain in us, the nucleus accumbens, is our seat of motivation, emotional pain and pleasure, but it's also where addictions act and compulsions work. And this is why addictions are so hard to recover from, because once your dragon brain decides that it wants you to acquire a substance, it will punish you until you do, because that's where emotional pleasure and pain are experienced. So the wolf brain is about love and attachment and play and teaching. Each of these has its own morality. The shark only cares about survival. The dragon wants power and pleasure. The wolf wants love, but only for those I care about. Angel brain wants truth and justice. So evolution has given us the anatomy to have this kind of one on top of the other control system of all these new social information processing capabilities that we've acquired over 500 million years. But developmentally, we start out, all of us, as sharks. A newborn baby is a toothless shark in my mind. I've had 4 of them with my wives. And the process of development is each brain has to tame the one below it. So terrible twos are all dragon brain all day long. It's all about power and control and no, I won't, and yes, you will. And so the dragon brain tames the shark brain, but then the wolf brain has to tame the dragon brain. And in some people, I'm not sure that ever happens. You can think of some people who seem to operate at the dragon level of, I really don't care about anybody but myself, and all I care about is money and power. So developmentally, some of us maybe only get to angel brain function periodically, and that's kind of normal. But the other part of this is development is a two-way street. That stress has the opposite effect. Any kind of chronic stress, allostatic load, it actually sends more resources to the older emotional primitive parts of the brain and takes resources away from the cortex. So literally, over time, the more you're chronically stressed, the stronger those dragon and shark impulses get, and the weaker the angel and wolf impulses get. And looked at this way, peritraumatic dissociation is an abrupt, stress-induced loss of connectivity between our angel brain, our conscious control system, and the rest of us. If you have a panic attack, for example, or a blind rage, that's your shark brain breaking free from its taming, operating independently. And once that happens to you, if you have a full-blown panic attack, your risk for having another one has gone way up, because that is an injury. That is damaging these connections. So now, from now on, they're not going to work as well as they did before. Okay, so let's push on. Now we're going to talk about moral injury finally. These are 6 domains of moral injury symptoms, which, if you read the broadest literature, are also the well-known symptoms of trauma. The first two domains are the principal symptoms, I believe, of any post-traumatic stress, and that is a change in emotional experience and a change in relationships. Emotional experience, clearly negative moral emotions are a huge part of moral injury, shame, guilt, anger, but it's way more than that, because what happens is I think it's a moral fever. And a fever is a shifting of the set point in your body temperature. And you have set points for all kinds of things. And I think we have a set point for our emotional climate, where if we're at rest, are we feeling negative feelings or positive feelings, or are we in the middle? I believe trauma is a shift. It's an allostatic load shift in emotional experience toward the negative, toward pain, and away from pleasure. And there's plenty of evidence for this: the numbness, the loss of compassion, the loss of ability to feel warmth and tenderness. These are, destroyed so many veteran families over the years. And there's always a loss of trust. Moral injury, as I define it as a breach of trust. It's always between two moral agents. And the aftermath of that is always alienation and difficulty connecting and trusting again. Concept of the world, those are Ronnie Janoff Bowman's 3 necessary assumptions. A lot of people have done work on the role of faith and religion in trauma and moral injury. There's a problem of theodicy. Researchers in that field describe this traumatic experience of people who say after a horrible thing happens that how could a loving God have let this happen? Authority over oneself are the biological losses of physical control that are most crucial to address immediately and as soon as possible, because nothing else is going to heal while somebody is having ongoing panic attacks or rage outbursts or destructive or dissociation, fragmentation. And then the last domain is continuity over time. Erik Erikson, the famous developmental psychologist, coined the term identity crisis while he was working in the VA in New York after World War II, where he was treating World War II veterans. And he said that what he learned is that what had happened to them is they had lost the person that they used to be and no longer knew who they were. They had lost their sameness over time. Okay, so now I'm going to show you my explanation for how a betrayal of a moral trust can inflict a lasting wound. And then based on that model, what can we do about it? So this is I call this a moral engine model. It asks the question, what is a person? And the answer is, a person is a moral engine fueled by sustaining emotional attachments. Now, if you read this left to right across the top, I think probably most people would agree that most people's goal in life, one of the goals, certainly the peak of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is self-actualization, right? To become the best you can be, but not to become more perfect for perfection's sake, but so that you can better contribute to the greater good through love, work, play, and creation on behalf of people and things you care about. This is our love system. This is about love. The missing piece is the bottom term, that this moral engine runs on. It is fueled by sustaining attachments. And without them, the engine stops. There are 3 types of these sustaining attachments, I believe, based on the work of Heinz Kohut, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. And I call them valued, valuing, and kindred. Kohut's terms were idealized, mirroring, and twinship, but these are the same ideas. I just use different terms. I like this picture because it illustrates all 3 types of valued attachments. And if we were doing this face-to-face, it'd be fun to just look and see how many we can find, right? Who's valuing whom here? Who is valuing what here? So valued attachment is someone or something you admire, look up to, and want to honor and emulate. A valuing attachment is to someone or something who acknowledges, honors, and admires you, right? Valuing values me, valued, I value someone or something else. And a kindred attachment is someone you share common identity with, like a teammate. So these are, this is all based on Kohut's work in Chicago in the 70s, mostly treating narcissistic personality disorders. The reason that his work is relevant here is not because moral injury is the same as narcissistic anything, although I believe they're related, but because in his work, he discovered two really important facts. Number one, that everybody needs these sustaining attachments every day of our lives, birth to death. It's not just for kids. This is for everyone. And the second thing is he discovered that what happens to a person when their sustaining attachments, self-objects, are pulled away or lost is they fragment and fall apart. They are no longer able to function normally. So, you know, up in the top right, I've got a picture of Wilson, which is the soccer ball that Tom Hanks' character in Castaway created as a companion while he was on this deserted island for several weeks. And so why did he have to do this? Why did he have to create a companion, name it, develop a relationship with it, talk to it, and then grieve when it died and he lost it? He didn't do it because he was lonely. He did it because he couldn't survive without that sustaining attachment. These are examples of self-object sustaining attachments. There's enormous capacity we have to attach to humans and non-humans, to internalize these attachments and make them part of who we are. So you see internal, external, human, non-human. The non-human external attachments, I think that's by far the biggest category, and I left off the biggest of those, money and power, but pets, possessions, you know, all these things. And then internal non-human are things about myself that I admire, that make me feel good about myself, abilities, gifts. This is why aging is a traumatic experience, because many of these things are lost over time. So what does moral injury do to a sustaining attachment? So this is my core model here. So on the left, I'm diagram this partial overlap between the self and these different types of attachments, that there's a common shared experience, and while a person is participating in that relationship, exercising that social identity, they are feeling feelings, thinking thoughts, and doing things that are maybe impossible any other time, right? That if you're, you're in the military, you're in uniform, you're at a ceremony, you're saluting the flag, you can't do that when you're not in that social setting anymore. So my point, though, is that if one of these attachments is lost abruptly because of trauma, where you don't have time to reel yourself back in and gradually decathect from the attachment, that you lose not only that attachment externally, but you lose the shared experience too. That's gone forever. So the moral injury and loss can't, if it's abrupt and their person does not have time to prepare to find new attachments to replace this one that's about to go, that causes an acute diminution in the self. And that's true whether it's a moral injury because someone else did something wrong, a moral betrayal, or I betrayed my own moral trust, because then I no longer can participate in valuing. I cannot be mirrored. You don't understand. I'm not worthy of that anymore. So in summary, this is my model of moral injury as an identity wound that on the right, a moral betrayal severs an internal or external sustaining attachment. The social self is diminished, self-esteem is diminished. And then, and this is the epicenter of the injury, that if a person could just get a new sustaining attachment, replace the old one, it would be not a big deal, right? My wife left me, all right, I'm going to go to the wife store. The problem is that that trauma also damages your ability to form new sustaining attachments. That's the trust problem and all that stuff. And then the moral engine sputters and slows, and that starts this cascade of worsening over time, more shrinking, more contracting socially until the person's homeless and living on the street with nothing. These are my patients at the VA. Okay, last principles for treatment. Number one, we need to accept and just embrace that the number one function we have in treating moral injury is to be a temporary patch, a sustaining attachment for the patient, and particularly as a valuing attachment. Not like, I'm your doctor, or listen to me, value me, and I'll take care of you. No, I want to listen to you and make you feel worthwhile. People, rail against that because it's very hard to do that for a living, to listen and be compassionate and empathic, person after person. But that is what they need, because that primes the pump. That gets the engine working again so they can develop new sustaining attachments elsewhere. Then deal with authority over oneself issues. You've got to get the panic, anxiety, rage, all that stuff under control. And that's a good place for medications. Then 3, figure out which sustaining attachments in which domain of what type have been lost. One way to do that is to draw a map of internal, external, human, non-human, valued, valuing, kindred, whatever. It's a very complex process. And if you do it right, if you do it honestly, it's also, it's very personal, because you have to, acknowledge that, part of my self-esteem comes from my car or, alcohol or whatever. Usually though, it's pretty clear when a person, so like getting out of the military is traumatic for so many veterans because so many of their sustaining attachments are ripped away. And if they're getting out is under adverse conditions because of misconduct, it's even more. So then last but not least, repair or replace damaged or lost sustaining attachments. And I know that's a mouthful, and it's not easy because the ability to form new attachments is damaged. But there are a lot of non-human replacements. And this is where, like, emotional support animals, why they're so effective, because they are great valuing attachments when a person can't get that anywhere else. So I'm at the end. I'm glad I got through in an hour when I had so much in there. I apologize, there's not much time left for questions, but I'll turn it over to Tess and Tom.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nash. Your work on behalf of veterans and their families, active duty service members, is just absolutely incredible. And we really value and thank you again for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. It's absolutely incredible. We do have a couple of questions. So I think we have a couple of minutes left. First one is Alex Heber here from Veterans Affairs Canada.
Hi, Alex.
Small world, huh?
Yeah.
I love that Bill is talking about Judith Herman's conceptualization of psychological trauma. My colleague Suzette Brumalt Phillips and I just finished doing a presentation for my Veterans Affairs colleagues on moral dilemmas and moral injury in frontline workers during COVID-19, using attachment theory as the basis of our talk. One of our main points was that facing moral dilemmas was more likely to lead to moral injury where there is poor attachment, lack of social support, and good leadership in an organization. I'd like to ask if Bill could please comment on the parallels between what he has seen in military and veterans and what is currently happening in first responders dealing with COVID-19. Thank you.
Oh, what a great question. I'm so sorry I missed that presentation. You and Suzette, I knew it was happening, but I couldn't clear my schedule. Yeah, so that is the second community in which moral injury is clearly evident. The first is the military, and the second is in human service workers, healthcare professionals, in us, right? And COVID has magnified those risk factors because of the moral dilemmas that they're discussing. So absolutely. All we need now is to document moral injury in a third community. For example, people who were abused or neglected as children, that I think it'll be like airtight. But you're absolutely right. It's the same. It's really the same.
Great. And we also have one more. We're running a little close to the cutoff time, but PTSD is used interchangeably with moral injury. Do you posit that moral injury is part of PTSD or complex PTSD?
I think it's more complex PTSD, right? So I think PTSD, as it's defined in DSM, is a more narrow group of disorders. I do believe, though, that most of the people who meet criteria for DSM PTSD also have moral injury. It's just, I'm not sure we're not even assessing for that. We have no idea, because nobody's evaluating people for complex PTSD, not yet.
And one last one. Wonderful talk, Bill. My sense is that most therapies, and especially manualized therapies like CBT and PE, offer little to no opportunities to examine or address moral injury. Judith Herman advocated psychodynamic psychotherapy. Barbara Milrod is now delivering a manualized psychodynamic psychotherapy, which, by the way, seems to be effective in decreasing dissociative symptoms in early studies. What form of psychotherapy do you recommend?
Absolutely relational. I got my own thing. It's kind of based on self-psychology. It's all about, Kohut's main drive is what he calls experience near. You ally with the person's subjective experience. You are their partner in that. And then you only later try to figure out what does this mean? The key is to walk with them in their experience.
And again, thank you, Dr. Nash, and thank you to everyone around the world for attending our first speaker series. I just wanted to let everyone know that links have been posted for general feedback for the webinar and will also be emailed out, as well as access to the survey to receive CE credit. And also the video of this presentation and a copy of the slides will be made available at our website, bfwc.ucla.edu. Dr. Nash, any final thoughts?
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Fantastic.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you.